Well, welcome to this week's Read Aloud. If the weather had accommodated, we might have a bigger crowd. So I hope you all take advantage of the cookies and coffee because we're going to have a lot of leftovers if this is as big as it gets. And it's unfortunate because we have a really wonderful speaker, Dr. Margaret Mills, from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. And she's going to present, she's not going to read, but she's going to present Afghan stories and folk tales. The tradition, I'll let her explain to you, is not a written tradition. It's an oral tradition of storytelling. And since this is considered an adult story time, it's very appropriate. So, if you will.
Thanks, Ruth. I can shout, but I'd much rather if you would move up, given the size and given what I'm going to do, which is tell some stories that are, generally speaking, told in people's houses around a little bitty fire or a little bitty stove. I should explain that my involvement with Afghan stories goes back to 1974, basically, although I was in graduate school before that. I went to Western Afghanistan ultimately. I was in Kabul for a while, and then I was in Herat mostly to do dissertation research on oral narrative. I didn't know what kind there would be most of, because nobody did, really. I mean, the Afghans did, but other people didn't. And what there was lots of in that context was folktales, basically. So I ended up staying a couple of years most of the time, and collecting stories from all sorts of people, whoever was willing to talk to me, men and women, and generally speaking in homes, in private context. So it was hanging out in an informal context, which is where most of the storytelling was going down. It wasn't a theatrical sort of a thing as it is in this country. And I should say that the storytelling revival in this country has actually made it more of a theatrical affair than it has been in the past. But if you're aware of storytelling, interested in storytelling, it's very lively in this country right now as a kind of a more formal theater thing. But I should say that this is the perfect time for telling stories. If you're Afghan, you are basically, people are not supposed to tell stories except after dark or in the winter when there isn't better stuff to do, like work. And in the winter, in the old days, there was stuff to do. It was basically handwork in the home in the winter. But even now, 85% of the population earns their living off the land, so the agricultural system dictated that people had time to hang out in the winter. And there were proverbs about why you shouldn't tell stories unless it was either dark or wintertime. And the polite version of this, people explained to me, was it causes confusion. It makes your head turn around. The impolite version of why you shouldn't do it is that your ass will grow teeth. And so things will get very confused if you tell stories out of timing, so to speak. Stories are also, these particular kinds of stories are also called lies. There are, like telling whoppers, telling tall tales, whatever, which we do too. There are also forms of oral narrative that are treated as historically true or profoundly spiritually true, and I'm not taking on that kind of stories today. But you do have some choices here, and I was debating what stories to tell. And I've been working right now on a book on women tricksters and trickster stories. The trickster is a type of character who appears all over the world and is a hero of cleverness and a hero of inversion, of turning things on their head, turning things around, treating things sort of opposite to the way you think they should be treated. There's a very lively and important trickster tradition in Native American storytelling. You may know about Coyote or Raven if you're from the Northwest Coast. And the trickster stories that are told in the Native American tradition are often cosmological. That is, they do have to do with the order of the universe. They're important. They're usually funny, too, but they're also about social and cosmic order. And the trickster stories that I'm working with are lies. They're fiction, but they're also considered to be having to do, I think, more with social and moral order, testing it, critiquing it, and doing other things. So I've got, right now, a headload of stories of tricksters, men and women. So that's one option. Another option is there's a little sequence of 3 stories. I should say these stories are fairly complicated, so I better start soon. But there's another option, which is the pros and cons of marrying snakes, which is a series of stories, 3 stories. And there's a huge long one that's basically the Persian. I don't know if any of you are into opera at all. You know the plot of Turandot. This is the Afghan Turandot story, and the original story of Turandot, which came through Turandot, which came through French, was actually an Eastern story. This particular one has a spin to it because the heroine is female. So anyway, I don't know what you want to hear. The trickster stories are very disorderly. All these stories were told not just for kids, so there are adult themes in some of them, some more, some less. But I don't know what you would like. Tricksters. Okay. Okay. What I want to start with is one I've been thinking about a lot, as you will know. And I should say that I'm not giving you like a verbatim readout of an Afghan performance of this thing. There's ways that stuff has to be the translator explaining in order for it to make sense, because like every other folktale tradition, it's deeply embedded in the culture. So there's stuff that Afghans know that goes without saying, and we hear it and go, So anyway, so this is not, like, I'm not reading you off my verbatim translations of Afghan stories, of which I do produce, but I don't think they were very well in performance. Anyway, so the story goes that there was this guy, and I should give credit, because I actually know who told this story. The guy who was a member of the Hazara Shia minority in Afghanistan, his name was Safdar Tabakoli, and he's still alive as far as I know. I hope to meet him someday. The story actually was told by him to a friend of mine who was Tajik, was doing his alternative service not to be drafted into the Russian army by being a translator at Columbia University back in the 80s. And he also wanted some time off to go off and collect stories. He's still an active folklorist. We worked together. Anyway, he managed to corral Safdar one time, and Safdar was a pretty famous storyteller at this point. So he told the story about a guy who decided he was going to be a mullah. So, I'm going to be a mullah. I'm going to be somebody. I'm going to go be a mullah is a Muslim priest, as you probably know. And sort of everybody's a mullah. There are higher echelons of mullahs, but he's just a thing to him. He says, well, to be a really good mullah, you need to have a book. I'm going to do a book. I sort of getting tenure, So I think I'll do a book on women's tricks. And I should say that Makrazan, women's tricks, is a topic in Islamic culture generally. And for various reasons, women tricksters are everywhere in stories. Sometimes they're heroes, sometimes they're villains, sometimes they're helping one side or the other, but they're all over the place. Anyway, so he says, well, I'm going to do some research on women's tricks, and I'm going to write up a book on the subject. So he goes down to the bazaar, he buys himself some paper, and he gets it stitched up into a manuscript, into a blank book, basically. And then he goes around, and he's watching women, and he's writing down. He writes down stuff like, okay, the little short ones do this, and the tall, skinny ones do that, and the light-colored ones do this, and the dark-colored ones do that, and the fat ones do this, and the skinny ones do that. And he's got this little typology in his own mind of women's tricks. And we should say, however, that this idea that physiology or physical appearance and character are related is actually an idea that goes back, and it goes back in European culture too. It's there really into the early modern period and even later, and that your face is your character. That's how you read it. Anyway, so that's his idea of a women's tricks book, and he's been doing this. And one day he goes out, he's outdoors, and he sees these 3 or 4 women who are sitting on a bank between a couple of fields, and they're doing whatever they're doing. One's spinning and somebody else is knitting, and they're sitting out there doing a little work. And so he sits down at a little distance and gets out his little thing, manuscript, and starts watching and writing, watching and writing, watching and writing. And you notice what he's doing, they don't like it. And one of them says to the other, what do you think he's doing? What's that guy doing? He's watching us and he's writing. She says, well, either he's writing poetry or writing spells. In either case, it's up to no good. Because writing poetry, that's a long story, but poetry is very, very important in Afghanistan. And one of the reasons it's important is that it's a venue in which you can talk about feelings. And in a lot of situations you don't. But poetry is his channel. And so if he's writing love poetry, this is highly inappropriate. Women doesn't even know. Or if he's writing spells to control them, that's even worse. So he's either writing poetry or he's writing spells. Either way, it's a bad deal. And so he gets up, he gets ready to go. And the one woman gestures to him and says, come here. And he says, no, I'm just going, get over here. So he goes over, she says, what were you doing? What were you writing? He says, nothing, sister, nothing to do with you, it's okay. She says, no, I know what you were doing. You were doing something. What was it? He says, nothing. And she says, listen, you tell me what you were doing, or else I'm going to call Haji Fulan, who's the big guy in the village. I'm going to call Haji Fulan and his guys to come and beat the crap out of you. So you tell me what's going on here. And the guy says, okay. He says, I'm planning to be a mullah, and I'm writing a book on women's tricks. And she says, that's a very bad idea. That could get you killed. And he says, I'm almost done. So don't worry about it. I'll be all right. I'm almost done with this. It's close to done. And she says, no, you don't want to do that. He says, no, it's okay. Don't worry about me. And she says, oh, well, okay. She says, would you like to come to my house and have tea? This is, it's more than even it appears to us. This is a flat out, come on. Will you drink tea with me is a euphemism. So he's, and Safdar says to the boys who are assembled, Safdar says, you know how mullahs are, they get hot quicker than anybody. So here's this guy. And so he follows her off to her house and goes along. And she takes him upstairs. There's a traditional Afghan house. It's got a little wall all around it, courtyard. Down below is, if they have any animals, there's a little stable down below. And on the second floor, there's living quarters. So she takes him in and she brings him up and she puts him in the guest room and sits him down on a nice cushion and says, you stay right here, I'll just get, food, actually there's food for lunch, I'll just heat it up and, sit here and I'll bring you some nice food and you'll have a nice time. So he sits there. And she, in due course, she goes down, locks the door to the outside, and she goes and she heats up this food and she lays out a nice eating cloth, Afghans eat on the floor on a clean cloth and sit, on like a big tray. And so she brings in all this food and she sets it down and there's nice cushions and everything. He's sitting there and she sits him down and they're starting to eat and she hands him a morsel of food, puts it in his mouth and gets really excited. And he hands her, he's giving her a morsel of food, put it in her mouth. All of a sudden, he knocks on the floor, on the door. And he says, what's that? And she says, lunchtime, it's my husband. And he says, you're kidding. He says, you brought me here like this as a stranger to your house, and you knew your husband was coming home for lunch. What were you thinking? She said, listen, it's no problem. I'll feed him and he'll leave and we'll go back to doing what we were doing. You just get in that trunk. There's that big old empty trunk. You just get in it, be quiet, no problem. Give him his lunch, leave. So she gets into the trunk and she locks the trunk and she puts the key in her pocket. And then she goes down to let in her husband, who's still pounding on the door, saying, what is it? Why did you, it's lunchtime, why did you lock the door? And so she opens the door and she brings him up. And there's a thing you got to know about the two of them. They had a bet going. Afghans, when they pull the wishbone of a chicken, they don't make a wish, they actually make a bet. And it doesn't matter whether you get the long end or the short end, you just break the bone and that you set the deal. And the deal is that you wager something that one person is going to give the other, either way. And the way you determine who has to do it is any time that one of the two people gives something to the other person, the receiver has to say, I remember our bet. And if they forget, they lose. And then they have to give the other person whatever it was they bet. So they got this bet going. And so she brings her husband in. Here's this lovely layout, with everybody, beautiful food, and he looks there and he says, what's the deal? He says, there's, who's here? Who is here besides me? And what's going on here? She said, the darndest thing happened today. I was going down just to the shop to get some bread. And there was this guy who was my boyfriend before we got married. I hadn't seen him since we got married. I didn't even know he was around. But there he was. And he said, oh my God, he said, I haven't been able to think about anybody but you in my whole life. You have haunted my life. You have stolen my peace. I never thought I was going to see you again. I have never loved anybody else. I just can't believe I'm seeing you again. And so what could I do? I invited him home for lunch. And her husband says, where is he? Where is he? And she says, he's in that trunk. At which point, the would-be mullah faints, loses it, and shits all over himself in the trunk. Completely loses control. It's in the trunk. Anyway, and the husband says, I can't believe it. You can't. What do you do? Give me, where's the key? Give me the key. So she gets the key out of her pocket. She says, here. And he takes the key and she says, I remembered. You forgot. I win. And what they had wagered, actually, was who should have the authority in the family. Who was going to be boss.